Hello, everybody. We are back with another awesome conversation today. We're rounding out the month of February, during which we've been talking about relationships and communication, healthy eating and nutrition, and leadership. And so we get to round out today on Leap Day of all cool days, talking with Sam Berkowitz, who has her master's in public health and is also a registered dietitian. And we're going to get started with Sam, first of all, by saying hi. Thank you for being here. I'm super excited to have you.
Thanks so much for having me today.
Absolutely. And we are going to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is how we, the adults, talk about food matters and how it impacts the teens and tweens in our lives. And the reason that this is of particular importance to me is that I definitely learned some fantastic habits from my mom when I was a kid. I learned that I could soothe my emotions by pulling the half gallon of ice cream out of the freezer and going to town. But I'm also vegetarian, and my mom had an idea that vegetarian meant healthy. And a lot of people, I think, have that idea. And I can attest to the fact that vegetarian doesn't necessarily mean healthy. So let's start with like kind of the basics. Like, how is it? It might seem obvious to some, but not to others. But how is it that the way that we talk about food impacts the kids in our world?
Yeah, so it has a lot to do with the language we use around food. And so, kind of like you mentioned, like when we're growing up, we learn a lot of those habits from our parents just because they're the ones we're most exposed to, or whether that's a different caregiver, and sometimes even outside the home in a daycare setting or school setting. And so, as they grow up and become teens and tweens, they have even more people that kind of are influencing their views between school and friends and social media and all the things. So a lot of times the way that we talk about food around these individuals really makes an impact. And so like when I work with a lot of adolescents or parents in the work that I do, a lot of times they'll say, well, I never comment on like their food or their body. But what I think the missing piece is it's how parents and caregivers are talking about themselves around food and body. And our adolescents pick up on that and use that as a mirror. Especially when, people say, oh, like you look so much like your mom or you look so much like your dad. And then we're saying about, oh, well, like I hate my body or I ate this, like that's so bad. And so it kind of mirrors back to them and say, oh, well, like, am I bad for eating that? Like, so a lot of that language is what becomes really important here, especially, just the labeling of food. So in society, I feel like, we're all very familiar with these foods are good or bad or healthy or junk or toxic is like the new word on social media right now, detox. And those words kind of create morality around food and saying like, oh, well, you're better for eating these foods and worse for eating these foods. And that really builds up for our teens and tweens and makes those food decisions very difficult for them.
So then we've got some ideas. I like how you even mentioned like junk food, right? Because I mean, that's certainly a term that I use that I wouldn't necessarily think about. My husband and I try not to keep much in the way of junk food in our home, but there's some potato chips out there and there's some ice cream in the fridge, not going to lie. What are so junk food, you said toxic food, you said good food, bad food. What are some other labels that you hear us using regularly that we want to be aware of? Because I mean, there's an aspect where like we can't necessarily eradicate all of this language from all of the influence, but what other language do we need to be particularly aware of about food and or body?
Yeah, I think it's really about just kind of keeping the language, at least that you're using, right? You mentioned you can't control everything in all of the places, but the language you're using at home to be neutral around food. So kind of like all foods have a purpose. And so I like to use like nutrient dense foods and play foods as labels with my clients. And so like foods like fruits and vegetables, those are more nutrient dense, right? That is just a fact. Instead of kind of putting this good morality word around it, just being like, this is fact. It has more fiber, it has more vitamins, it has more nutrients. versus a play food, which would be like cookies or cake or, all those things that maybe you would typically kind of say is a junk food. But what this does is it kind of shows like there's a purpose for both. When we eat a salad, that can either be because, we want something fresh and crispy and crunchy, or, maybe sometimes our bodies really crave that nutrient dense meal. And then when we have a cookie or a cupcake, that's nourishing us in a different way, maybe not in a nutrient dense way, but in an enjoyment, a social factor way.
Sure.
And just kind of, I guess, being open-minded to that, like, all these foods have a place. And when we kind of say that some don't, is where I tend to find adolescents really struggle with that relationship with food.
I really like that idea because it's, as somebody who learned some fantastically healthy habits, as we opened with, right, when I was a kid, I can totally sense that morality or that judgment, right? That,
Mhm.
it's a moral failing if I eat too many cookies, when I'm sorry,
Right.
like Girl Scout cookies, I think have something magical in them that, like, who can really only eat 3 Thin Mints? Let's be honest, right? So, but going, okay, there's a place for play and there's a place for nutrition and nutrients in my body.
Mhm.
And that doesn't make me bad for sitting down and eating an entire sleeve of Samoas or something like that, right? That, like, there's a
Yeah.
place for that. And maybe my husband and I split it. And that's just a time that we're spending together, or it's something that you share with your teen, something like that.
Mhm.
So, okay, so being aware of some of the negative terms, keeping them neutral. I love the
Mhm.
suggestions that you've offered. What are some other steps that we can take, those of us in the village, the parents, the grandparents, the,
Mhm.
aunts and uncles, the people that, host the birthday parties, whatever. What are some other things that we can do that are intentionally focused on fostering healthy relationships with food for our kids?
Yeah. So something that you can kind of start doing at any age, especially if you have younger kids, but this can be applied like even up to like the teenage level, is not making a big deal about sweets and candy and those types of foods. And so what this does is kind of like you mentioned, like, and I feel like Girl Scout cookies are one of those things because it's a seasonal item, right?
Sure.
So kind of they only come around sometimes. And that can be said about Christmas cookies and things that come around like Halloween candy. So
Hmm.
when a parent or someone in the village is, no candy in the house, no cookies in the house, no sweets in the house,
Hmm.
it is this sense of deprivation. And a lot of people say, well, yeah, but those are bad foods, right? They're not healthy. I don't want to keep them in my house. And I hear you, and I totally get that. But what happens is it kind of puts these foods on a pedestal of like, oh, these are only sometimes foods. And that's when we tend to binge or overeat those foods because they're not available all the time. And so something that can be done is like offering, dessert with a meal. That tends to be more helpful with younger kids, right? To kind of be like, this is all an option. And, you can eat this or you can have a bite of cupcake and then a bite of chicken. And like, it's kind of just there.
Interesting. So
Um,
instead of keeping it
mhm.
like at the end of the meal, just have it out served with the meal. Is that what you mean?
Potentially, yeah, and not saying you have to do that all the time, but it can be something that just it kind of creates, like, a more normalcy around the food, and so, like, a good
Got it.
example of this is kind of, like, especially for kids, when you tell a young child or a teenager, "Don't do that,"
What do
now
they
they're
do?
gonna go do it, right? And so, it's the same way with our brain and food, right? Don't eat the cookie, don't have the chips. Now we want those
Right.
things even more because they're like those forbidden foods. But yeah, kind of just not making them a big deal. And when we have candy available all the time or, on a regular basis, we're less likely to overeat at Halloween because we're like, okay, well, like this is candy and it's great, but I know I can also have it next month if I want
Anytime.
candy next month. Yeah.
Right. Interesting. Okay. So really, I mean, that's not all that different than like a lot of the conversations that I look to have here with Parent Tween Connection is normalizing the thing, right?
Hmm.
Like we tend to have complicated relationships with things that
Hmm.
are not talked about or not observed or not
Right.
engaged with on a regular basis, whether we're talking candy or whether we're talking sexuality or whether we're
Yep.
talking mental health. So
Mhm.
in kind of like my interpretation, you're saying normalize having it around, make it okay. And if we don't make it this like super cool forbidden thing, it becomes less
Yeah.
appealing in some ways. A
Exactly.
little bit of reverse psychology there.
A little bit, yeah. Because
Okay.
kind of something we see, like, as when kids are very young is they're very intuitive eaters right out of the womb, right? So, it's only from our and media's influence that kind of puts these good, bad, like, these things around our
Sure.
views around food. But, like, to a young child, a cookie is a food, and chicken is a food, and a smoothie is a food, right? They're just foods and they taste different, and maybe they like one more than the other, but they don't really have any particular view about them until we kind of perpetuate that for them.
So, what other things that can we do, especially for athletes, young athletes as they're
Mhm.
growing and, they maybe we've got some picky eaters or kids who don't like to eat their trees or things like that, right?
Mhm.
What are some other things that we can do? We've got normalizing the not so
Mhm.
healthy that as we might refer to them. What are some
Mhm.
other things that families can do to again continue fostering a good relationship? And in my brain, good means willingly and frequently incorporating those nutrient dense foods, whatever they are, right? Because that's really what
Yeah.
gives our body the fuel. The other stuff
Right.
kind of gives us that emotional satisfaction, whether it's a social
Mhm.
setting or it's a memory association or something like
Right.
that. What are some other habits or other ways that parents can help foster these positive relationships?
Yeah, I would say trying to offer nutrient dense foods in different ways. So I think a lot of the times we feel like we can only eat vegetables as like roasted vegetables or like very basic, like this is your broccoli, right? But kind of being a little more creative with that. And that can be like salsa is a vegetable. Pico de gallo on top of a taco is a vegetable. It's tomatoes, it's onions, it's garlic, right? So just kind of being a little more open to like maybe salsa and those things aren't a whole serving of vegetable on its own, right? But that serves a purpose and adds nutrients. And also just like mixed dishes can be a really great way to add in like nutrient dense food. So just because we've mixed all these foods together, I feel like there's this perception that now it's like unhealthy, but really it's all those same things if they were separate, right? So if that's broccoli and mac and cheese or, chicken Alfredo with broccoli, I don't know, you said broccoli. Now I'm like on that train, but like we can add it into things. And just because it has cream or cheese or whatever, like that doesn't negate the nutrients that they're getting from that vegetable. And it might be, maybe they're not open right now to eating broccoli just plain, but maybe they're open to having it in their dish so the taste is kind of masked.
Awesome. And I actually want to take a second and give a shout out. We had a conversation with Debbie Brosnan of the Effortless Kitchen a few days ago, where she actually was talking about some more ideas, I think, that can even tag on to what you're talking about here
Mhm.
about how to make it easier to incorporate healthier eating on a regular basis. And
Mhm.
that was really geared more toward moms and dads to go, hey, how can you make it more approachable for you when you've got a thousand
Mhm.
things going on? And how do you eat healthfully?
Right.
She gave some really insightful tips that I think are gonna be pretty easy to incorporate. There were some that I was like, "My
Mhm.
goodness, I could do that," and
Yeah.
just things that I hadn't thought of because it's not my norm.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but she was also talking about getting kids into the kitchen. So to
Mhm.
tie the 2 together, and you're talking about fostering this positive relationship, what do you see as the registered dietitian or, like, from that perspective, what do
Mhm.
you see can come out of getting kids in the kitchen in terms of this healthy relationship with food?
Yeah. So getting kids in the kitchen is a really great way to kind of connect them with the food. So even if the first time you make a meal and say it includes a vegetable or some nutrient dense food that they're not usually up for eating, involving them in the process, I'm not really sure exactly what the psychology connection is, but it kind of like gets their buy-in, like they've worked to make this food, and I think
Mhm.
they're more inclined to want to try it because they spent all this
Mhm.
time making it. And it really just also like, maybe if it's a texture thing that they don't like certain foods, it allows them to touch them and,
Mm.
kind of make that connection with them before eating them. And sometimes over time, that can really be helpful for kids that struggle with kind of that texture feel of vegetables.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that tactile,
Mhm.
texture perspective of it because, yeah, like, my husband doesn't like hummus or guacamole because of the texture issue. I love both of
Mhm.
them. So, like, when I
Yeah.
buy them, I'm like, "Great, I know they're all mine. I don't have to worry
Right.
about anybody stealing them." But it's an interesting texture that to see how it like, the hummus goes from, like, the chickpea over to the hummus, and maybe they don't like
Mhm.
it in chickpea format, but maybe they like it in hummus format once it's been blended.
Mhm. Yeah, and, like, maybe they can touch it and feel it or smell it and, aren't feeling obligated to eat it in that moment yet, and so it allows some exposure before kind of eating.
What a great perspective. I never would have thought of that. I'm glad I asked.
Of
Talk
course.
to me about your perspective, and I should say this is coming from my perspective as a former personal trainer, and that,
Okay.
I didn't have the nutritional coaching background, but I had
Mhm.
a fundamental understanding. Talk to me about the benefits and or drawbacks of reading food labels and teaching kids to read food labels.
Mm.
Because you mentioned
Yeah,
nutrient dense earlier, and I know that you
yeah.
and I know what that means, but how do we teach our kids what that means?
Yeah, so a way to kind of teach kids about nutrient dense foods is talking about like what certain foods contain. So saying like, oh, like fruits and vegetables that are red and orange and yellow tend to have vitamin C, and that's good for our immune health, and kind of making those connections. Because not all of those like micronutrients are listed on food labels.
Mhm.
And food labels, I have it's a, like, mixed bag of relationship with it. I think a lot of us have been taught that the food label tells us how bad a food is, how much carbs it has, how much salt it has, how much sugar it has, and that's kind of our association with reading the label. Um, Honestly, I don't read food labels that often.
Sure.
But I think there is a place for that, right? If that makes you feel more comfortable, or, if you have a child with, say, type 1 diabetes, right? We need to be reading food labels so we can calculate insulin for carbs, things like that. I think just placing less value on the food label and the serving size that it suggests. So the serving size that is on a food label is what they predict most people eat. That's why they tend to kind of change. Um, I feel some way about that because they're like 10 chips. So
Right? 3 Girl Scout cookies, again.
right, yeah, yeah, exactly. So, but I try to take away that, like, you can eat maybe what they consider one serving. Maybe that's one serving if you're having all these different things, but if you're eating something as like you're having a sandwich with chips and that's like basically half your meal, right? Maybe you're having more than one serving of chips, but that's okay. And that's where I really work with clients to kind of tune into those hunger and fullness cues as their indicators instead of set serving sizes that are kind of arbitrary because
Mhm.
like you said it doesn't really meet what, how much we're typically eating, or maybe it is for one person but it doesn't mean it is for the other.
Well, and then there's also the fact I know from having worked with a number of moms over the years, and my husband actually
Mhm.
was a personal trainer, worked with a lot of athletes over the years, that
Yeah.
when kids are about to go through a growth spurt, you're
Mhm.
gonna be pretty sure that there are gremlins in your pantry because the food is just gonna disappear in an
Yeah.
absolute half a hot second, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we're both on the same page of going like, when you notice that, we don't need to make a big deal out of it, right? Because then
Exactly.
there's that judgment that comes in of like, oh my gosh, you're eating me out of house and home. Yes, they may be.
Right.
Okay. But the fact is that we don't need to bring a judgment to it. They're not bad for it. They're doing what their body needs to
Right.
do. And to your point of them being intuitive eaters out of the womb, that if they're about to go through a growth spurt, they're gonna eat. Like that's just
Mhm.
biologically what they need. They need the fuel.
Exactly, and that kind of brings into, like, the last kind of part of like how to foster a good relationship with food that I kind of wanted to touch on is, kind of talking about and leading by example of why we don't like comment on other people's bodies or their food choices. Because just like you said, like there's a reason for that and we're all different. And so like making comments like, you're still eating, like I'm so full, seems like just any other comment and really is normalized. But what it does is it's kind of like judging them for what they're eating. And maybe they are still hungry and maybe tomorrow they'll eat less. Maybe they won't. But right, like we don't know all these other factors that are going on. And so these comments tend to just end up having a negative impact, even if you don't mean them in that way.
Well, and I can definitely hear things in my head, where I can be out with friends as an adult, fully formed adult
Yeah.
with my own fully formed relationship with food,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And I can, I see how much my friends eat sometimes versus how much
Mhm.
I eat.
Mhm.
And go, I hear things in my head of like, oh, well, no wonder I'm, XYZ compared to
Yep.
their,
Right.
weight, size, whatever it is. But
Yep.
really that's between me and my food plate and my nutritionist, or my doctor if it
Mhm.
comes to it,
Yeah.
not between me and them because we've just got different bodies and different needs.
Exactly. And it's just we can't know like what we need, what they need, what they ate earlier in their day. Maybe, there's just so much to not know. And when people make comments about other people's eating habits, what I like to remind people is that's a reflection of their relationship with food
Mhm.
more than yours.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, so then the next topic that I know a lot of parents ask questions about because
Mhm.
they're not sure. What are
Yeah.
some warning signs that we need to pay attention to that indicate that our kids have or are struggling with their relationship with food? Maybe it's not even to the point of navigating disordered eating or anything like
Mhm.
that, but it could, I mean, there are certainly precursors that we want to be aware
Right.
of before it gets to that extreme. So, can you speak to some of that?
Yeah.
What parents need to pay attention to?
Totally. Yeah, and so this is not like an extensive list, but just a couple
Sure.
things that you might notice. And right, this doesn't mean they have disordered eating or an eating disorder. It can, but it can also just mean maybe it's time for a conversation around like how they're feeling about their body or food in general, and to kind of just touch base. So one thing could be wearing really baggy clothes. When maybe that's not what they're usually doing. This
Okay.
is usually how individuals like to they feel uncomfortable in their body, so they're trying to hide like what it might
Mhm.
really look like. Excessive exercise, if you feel like, aside from maybe starting a new sport, and so maybe that's their seasonal sport, but starting to really work out all the time or like a lot beyond practice in the usual kind of sports routine that the coaches set. And sudden changes in eating patterns. This one can be difficult, especially like you mentioned, for tweens and teens. That can happen because of a growth spurt, and that's totally normal. But I'd say if someone is eating a lot less than they usually do, and it's,
Mhm.
for it's an extended period of time versus, a day here or there. And they stop eating foods that they used to really love, and now they say they don't like them. And our taste buds change, and that can happen, but this tends to be foods like, "Oh, I don't like candy anymore. Oh, I don't like those cookies anymore," right? They don't like them, but do they really not like them? Or is it, you know, they have a certain view about them, and so they don't wanna eat them anymore?
Mhm.
Similar to hiding food, finding hidden food in your child's room usually is a connection, right? That you've said, oh, like no eating candy, this or that. That's usually when parents find those hidden foods in their child's
Mhm.
room when cleaning or just, you know, looking for
Right.
something. And especially wanting to eat alone. So, not wanting to eat with others. This can be declining social events that have food or just, feeling uncomfortable eating at a big family meal. Usually, someone that's really uncomfortable either with their body or their food intake doesn't want to be like around others when they're doing that.
Mhm. So I just had a thought and I've lost it.
Mhm.
Okay, so here it is. I found it. It's back. If we see some of these behaviors that
Yeah.
seem different, right?
Right.
to the point of wanting to normalize, and you talked about like not necessarily talking about how much someone is eating or talking about their body in
Right.
those ways and being cognizant of the way that we talk about our food consumption and our behaviors. If
Mhm.
we notice some of these behaviors that may be indicative of challenges brewing, what's the
Mhm.
best way, from your perspective, for a parent to approach that with their kiddo?
Yeah. I think it's really coming from a place of curiosity versus judgment. And this can be hard because teens sometimes can be a little guarded and, don't like to tell their parents things. And,
Mhm.
but to kind of really try and ask in a non judgmental way, as well as maybe not talking about the one like, oh, like you're eating more or less than you usually do. And maybe asking, like, hey, like I noticed, like, you're not wearing these clothes anymore. Or, you know, is there a reason, you really don't like sitting at family meal and you like to eat in your room now? And, if they say, no, there's no reason, kind of just sitting back and saying, okay, and maybe revisiting that like another time just so you don't, it doesn't feel like prying, because then they might kind of shut down on you. But
Mhm.
just kind of being curious and keeping that like neutral and kind of conversation to
Mhm.
allow them to share when they're ready and to kind of hopefully maybe they'll come to you maybe another time and know like
Got it.
you're noticing but like aren't being judgmental.
Mhm. And I think that's something that, especially for teenagers, like you said, they are kind of guarded, but I think it's kind of like part and parcel of the teenager realm that they
Mhm.
feel judged, even if the
Right.
intention from the adult is not to be judgy. And
Exactly.
so just be sensitive. I like, we actually have at Parent Tween Connection, we have what I call the foundations of connection, where like each
Mhm.
letter and the word connection spells out a concept. And one of them is
Oh, yeah.
curiosity. And I think
Yep.
curiosity is the antidote to judgment. So I really was like, oh, hey, she's like right on my wavelength. We talked about these same concepts there. So, um,
Yeah.
and then at what point does somebody really benefit from having someone like you on their team?
Mhm. Yeah, so a lot of the adolescents I work with are really struggling with food. So maybe like they've really taken down their intake to like, you know, I don't like to use numbers because it can be triggering for some people, but like much less than what is meeting their nutritional needs, or maybe
Sure.
they are fainting, losing muscle mass, certain things like that, where we're really
Mhm.
noticing these signs of deterioration physically. And now it's not to say like not everyone that really struggles with food fits that bill of like malnourished and very skinny. Some people's bodies don't really change that much, but there are certain things that we can notice. If someone's not eating enough, they have a lot of headaches a lot of the time. They might be fainting. They might be very um, short with low patience, which is difficult because that's kind of baseline for some teenagers.
It really is. Yes.
Yeah, but like maybe it's different than what their usual kind of manner is.
Sure.
Um, and I think maybe if they are playing sports, like you mentioned, maybe their performance has really declined. Um, and that's usually a trend we see with athletes because they're not going to be able to keep up maybe what their baseline is if they're not eating.
Right. Absolutely. Awesome. And I know, again, for just my own personal experience and my background in the training world and a lot of the interviews that I've conducted, that a lot of emotional and mental challenges stem from less, let's call it subpar nutrient intake, right? And that for a
Mhm.
lot of kids and a lot of humans, if we can get more of the nutrient dense foods in, it can contribute to resolving a whole host of issues. I'm not going to say that nutrition or any one aspect of
Mhm.
anything is the
Yeah.
cure all, right? But nutrition, I
Right.
think, tends to be overlooked by a lot of people. They don't consider
Mhm.
that, if all we're eating is crap, we're not fueling. Okay, there's my judgment again, right? There's my bad. If all we're eating is play foods,
Yeah, no, but I
right?
think it's I get what you're saying too. Like it's not we do sometimes after eating so many chips and cookies and maybe takeout for days and days and days, we feel not at our best. And that's
Yeah,
okay to write like to talk about. Like it doesn't make that food bad. It's just that's why the variety is so
mhm,
important.
for
And I
sure.
think also like a child an adolescent can benefit from working with a dietitian when sometimes it really takes that like neutral third party to break
Mhm.
through. And sometimes, the parent can try their best, but maybe that child is just really guarded and needs that neutral third person to kind of
Right.
approach that relationship. And so if you feel like maybe you're not sure, that could be a great way to kind of work with a dietitian and just let that be sparsed out.
Awesome. All right, Sam, how do people find you if they want to get more information or learn about your services and your support? Website? Are you on socials? Where do they find you?
Yeah, so my website is www.sammy, Sammi, B as in boy, nutrition.com. And there you can see all about my services. I work one-on-one with clients. I do accept insurance, so you can check your benefits on my website. And then I do hang out on Instagram a little bit. And so that's going to be at Sammy with an I, B dot nutrition.
Awesome. Very cool. So thank you, Sam, for being with us. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I'm excited because just momentarily, Sam and I are going to pop over into the Parent Tween Village, and we're going to have another or have a continuation of this conversation, but it's really going to focus in on social media and
Mhm.
disordered eating. And she calls
Mhm.
it the ultimate comparison. So I'm excited to see what she has to say about that and to learn more about how we can better support teens and tweens. If you're not yet a member of Parent Tween Village, pop on over to parenttweenconnection.com and you can join. As it stands as of Leap Day 2024. It is a whopping $7 a month for the first year. I'm sure that there are plenty of nuggets that you're going to get out of our conversations with professionals like Sam. So thank you so much, and I will see you soon.
All righty.